I'll come to you now, Andrew. What needs to happen in terms of getting the government's agenda moving, or in fact creating an agenda? Because we know at the May election the government was light on detail and heavy on the politics.
Indeed, and I actually sympathise with the idea that they do need to try to spell out in more detail a concrete agenda that they will fill the remaining 2.5 years of their term with. As it happens, I think there is in fact very much a coherent, philosophically coherent, cohesive, politically achievable agenda that would go a long way to improving growth that they could take on. And if you'll forgive me doing a little bit of self-promotion here, I actually am hoping to be publishing in about 3 or 4 weeks' time a book in which I try to lay out exactly in detail, down to specific policy proposals, what such an agenda would be, just to briefly flag the main areas that I think the government should be focusing on. As you said, productivity is essential, but finding the right areas to focus on there is important. The top priority one is, as Terry said, energy policy, and there needs to be some significant changes there. But there's also some significant reform that could be done in terms of federal-state relations to boost the incentive for state and territory governments to be pro-jobs and pro-growth. And there's also some important reforms that could be done in higher education. On top of that, you also mentioned just before the break the importance of getting wages growth going again, and both there and in relation to housing prices. A key thing is actually to get our immigration program back under better control, because that's one of the key things that's undercutting wages growth. So there's some of the key elements that I think the government should be focusing on.
And what's your priorities, Adam?
Well, look, just on this topic of an agenda, look, I'd like to be harsh on the government. I think its agenda's hopeless, really. There is no agenda. I mean, you think back over the past 5-6 years with there's been so many stillborn inquiries into the Federation, into tax. There was a National Commission of Audit. It's all basically been dumped. The government talks about tax cuts, but these are laughable tax cuts. They don't really take effect for 5 years. And they aren't even tax cuts anyway. The share of tax of disposable income is increasing every single year in the economy. That is why the budget is going back to surplus. It's because of higher taxes. It's not because of lower spending. And there's just no agenda. I mean, the agenda is so thin that we're seeing state governments actually come out now and try to lead a national push for tax reform, and that's fairly unprecedented. So, look, I'd really like the government to think over the summer months about what it wants to do for the next 2 years of its term. I think personally they should bring forward these income tax cuts. I mean, I think that would be an easy thing to do to try to boost the economy. The September retail sales figures, I think, have really put the stake in the heart of this first round of tax cuts and shown that they weren't a stimulus at all.
Yeah, and those retail figures are really damning, and they're in negative territory, which is the first time in many years. Terry McCrann, there are plenty of people out today saying that the rates cuts to date are not working in the way they're meant to work. Is that a fair criticism? And if so, what happens next?
I just want to take issue with that. I think because it's easy to say that you look at the rate cuts, you look at the tax rebate, and it didn't work because we saw those negative retail sales figures, and we'll yet to see what the overall economy did. But I think we all need to note what would the counterfactual have been if we hadn't have had the rate cuts and if we hadn't had the tax handback. So it would obviously, in my judgment, would obviously been worse. I think that this is, given that particularly the rate cuts, I think it's time, as Adam was sort of hinting at, for both the government and the Reserve Bank to take the next couple of months to really sit back and think about, if not in some grand agenda, but certainly how they should respond to what's actually developing, not only in the domestic economy, but in the global economy. We live in very febrile times now, particularly in the global economy with the zero interest rate. So I think it's time for some thought and some consideration, which you can develop into something that might be akin to an agenda, if you like. The next stop, I think, importantly, is the mid-year budget update just before Christmas. Let's see what the numbers are actually like. Let's get a better sense of where the overall economy is, and then make those judgments, policy decisions after that.
Look, I think Terry McCrann's absolutely right. I mean, if it's not great now, can you imagine the alternative if the election had gone the other way in May? Oh, look, I absolutely agree with that. But just because the alternative was worse doesn't mean that the current incumbent doesn't need to do better. Andrew Stone, I'm interested, is perhaps there some lagging effect to the election win Is confidence actually turning around, but it's a bit slow to present itself in the retail data numbers, let's say, for example. But of course, going into Christmas, a lot of businesses are hanging on for the Christmas sales period, hoping that they can turn things around, that we see some positive green shoots in the economy. Is that fair, or do you think things are going to tighten up?
Well, certainly the consumer confidence data to date has not suggested that people are feeling more confident. My own view is actually that the tax cuts, in fact, are helpful. And in fact, much of that will only be happening now because many people only put their tax returns in October, and then it takes a little while to process and they get the refunds. What I think is interesting is that I think the Reserve Bank made a serious mistake by cutting the cash rate 3 times, and that's actually proved to be in my view, a more damaging thing than I'd expected, in that it actually seems to have significantly hurt confidence. But it also gets to the core problem here is that all of these steps are trying to stimulate some extra growth, by adding to demand, by basically encouraging people to borrow more. You can only do that for so long. We have been spending the last several decades trying to encourage households and businesses, but especially households, to borrow more, to the point where household debt to household disposable income, the ratio of those two, is now at an extremely high level by international standards, and much higher than it was even at immediately before the global financial crisis. So this is the trouble. We can't keep trying to prop up the Christmas sales or the whatever by trying to cut interest rates further or by trying to give a few more tax cuts. We actually have to get to the heart of the supply side here. Why is it that the economy is not growing better? Why is it that businesses aren't investing, even though the cost of investing in terms of interest rates is extraordinarily low? There have to be these more deep-seated structural problems, which is why I do believe a serious productivity agenda is needed. And as I said, a key part of that is energy policy, but also there are these other areas where it's important to start realigning incentives to encourage businesses to be out there and spending and growing jobs.
Oh, but I mean, Adam, you raised this before. Unless we get our house in order on energy, what is Australia going to be mining? Well, not much. And what is Australia going to be manufacturing? Not much. We can't all be a country of baristas and nail technician salons. I mean, what are we going to produce to generate our wealth, to maintain our standard of living, if we don't solve the energy conundrum? And if we stop, as we should, I think, the Ponzi scheme of immigration, what's going to generate Australia's wealth?
Well, certainly just on manufacturing, you're quite right. Manufacturing employment has been shrinking for the past 5 years. We've lost, I think, 70,000 jobs, whereas in the US, of course, where energy prices are a lot lower, both the share of employment in manufacturing and also the number of manufacturing workers has been increasing for the past few years. So I suppose it can be done. If you can somehow lower your energy costs, you can stimulate your manufacturing sector. I mean, I think we really do need in some way to revive a manufacturing sector in Australia. I mean, it's difficult to do. I don't have all the answers here, but certainly we should try. But just on the topic of what the government can do, I just wanted to refer to a story in tomorrow's Australian, and the level of regulation, just at the federal level, is actually up 9% since the coalition was elected back in 2013. So for all the talk of deregulation, there's actually more regulation. And so if you're looking at a place to start to boost the supply side of the economy, as Andrew said, that would also be a good place.
All right, I'll go straight back to you, and on that, Andrew Stoner, you were there when the government was elected in 2013. The government had a commitment, what was it, 2 in, 2 out, 1 in, 2 out, or something like that for every regulation made. A number of regulations had to go out. And there were 2 days in the parliamentary calendar, one at the start of the year and one at the end, where a whole lot of regulation that was costing business, green tape and red tape, was repealed. Now, along came Malcolm Turnbull, and that was promptly thrown out. There is no repeal day anymore. Is that the stuff that needs to happen?
It is. I think that's actually the critical thing. Cutting red tape is actually really hard, and to be fair to governments, actually, businesses are a lot better at complaining about this than actually saying specifically what they'd like to have changed, what's causing the problems. Nevertheless, the key point was, as you said, when the Abbott government came in to try to make this a real priority, they made it a high-profile thing. So you had these 2 days in Parliament devoted exclusively to that, and what was the impact of that? What it meant is that each minister and each minister's department had to be making sure that they could bring some serious proposals for deregulation to Cabinet that could be approved before that, or otherwise it was very embarrassing for those ministers. Roll forward to the following the coup when Tony Abbott was knocked off, immediately those days were scrapped, and the deregulation agenda became a matter of tabling an annual report in Parliament, which means sometime at 11 p.m. someday someone puts a thing on the notice paper and then it's gone. Nobody pays any attention. So
it's worth pointing out too just there that actually that did work. In 2014 there was a 5% drop in the volume of regulation. So the acceleration, the growth, if you like, has all been since 2014, not 2013.
And this is a point, isn't it, Terry McCrann? A bit of naming and shaming
Yes.
keeps the bureaucrats honest, and governments get busy on the politicking. But unless you have a date where they're exposed in the parliamentary schedule, not tabling a report, but actually putting through legislation to deregulate, this stuff just grows like topsy, and it does get out of control. And quongos too. These are those bodies that are created that cost the taxpayer literally hundreds of millions of dollars and do bugger all.
Well, again, using the US example, Peter, it's not only the energy comparison which shames us, it's the regulation comparison that also does so. I mean, since Donald Trump was elected, he has seriously reduced the amount of regulation in the US. He's actually delivered on not a 2-for-1, cut 2 for every one new one. He's delivered more like something like a 10-to-1 ratio, 10 cuts to every new one. And I think it obviously brings us back again also to the whole mess that we have of federal-state financial relations in Australia. And I certainly agree with the two guys in Sydney that this is fundamental, to getting Australia working more effectively. Is to make some start on fixing up both the fiscal imbalance between the two levels of government, but also the responsibility.
Well, gentlemen, I've got to leave it there. Terry McCrann, Dr. Andrew Stone and Adam Creighton. I'll tell you what, if Donald Trump gets knocked off next year by the comments tonight on the economic front, at least we should get him to come here and do a bit of an internship in the Australian Parliament. Gentlemen, thanks for your time.
Thanks.